Call to meeting, or to order the meeting of the April 3rd Oversight Committee. And would you call the roll, please?
Board members Abkarian.
Here.
Nakasone. Ochoa.
Here.
Sheehan.
Here.
Steger. And Chair Raggio.
Here. Let the record show that we have a quorum. And now may I have an approval of the minutes, please?
If I may, I'll read the report of the Secretary. The agenda for the April 3rd, 2013 regular meeting of the Glendale Oversight Board was posted on Friday, March 29, 2013 on the bulletin board outside City Hall, and then 2A's approval of minutes.
Thank you.
Move to approve.
Any additions or deletions to the minutes? If none, roll call, please.
Board members Abkarian.
Yes.
Berry. Yes. Nakasone. Ochoa. Yes. Sheehan.
Yes.
Steger. And Chair Raggio.
Yes. Minutes are approved. Next item, please.
There are no informational items. The next item would be action items at 4A, Director of Community Development regarding consideration of a resolution of support in favor of Assembly Bill 981, and at 4A1 is resolution supporting the Assembly Bill 981.
Yes, sir. Lots of fame.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Oversight Board, staff is requesting you adopt a resolution of support for Assembly Bill 981 and authorize staff to take necessary actions, draft letters on your behalf, and send them to the legislature. In February of 2012, all redevelopment was dissolved in California as a result of Assembly Bill 26 and then a follow-up legislation, AB 1484. The law provides that bond funds could be used after a finding of completion. However, only those funds that were issued prior to December 31st, 2010 would fall into that category. In March, according to then existing law, the Glendale Redevelopment Agency issued some $50 million in taxable bonds, as did about 50 other agencies statewide, lawfully issued bonds. The law does not allow us to use those. Those bonds were issued for affordable housing, for public infrastructure and facilities, and economic development, all generating jobs for those projects, all consistent with what we believe are the goals of the state of California. As I noted, there was about 50 other agencies that issued bonds. Currently, there is about $650 million sitting on the sidelines in bond proceeds that cannot be used, according to the law. With unemployment hovering around 10%, largest in the country, that $650 million could be put to good use. The League of California Cities has estimated that that would translate into about 9,500 jobs, generate about $60 million in state and local taxes, and $1.2 billion of economic activity throughout the state of California. Assembly Bill 981 proposes two very minor changes with very big effects. The bill would move the date from December 31st, 2010 to June 28th, 2011. That's when the legislature actually voted to abolish redevelopment. So bonds that were issued, lawfully issued within that period of time, could then be used, again, after the finding of completion. And that is when all of the true-up payments and everything has been accounted for and resolved in unwinding the redevelopment agency. Staff believes that this bill is consistent with the goals and interests of all the taxing entities, and we would ask that this board adopt a resolution in support that we would send to Assemblymember Bloom. If you have any questions, we're here to answer them.
Albert?
Microphone, please. Microphone.
The $35 million that the city will gain by doing this, could it be spent on new projects or the current projects already on the line items?
Could be spent for both.
Okay, so if let's say if soccer fields needs to be built for the community, that money could go towards that 35, some portion of that 35 could be used to build soccer fields, do whatever you need to do in the community. Besides the actual line items that are in the line item, you can use it for other items that are not line items in the ROPS.
I would answer that question this way. Simply, the short answer, yes. There are in the bond documents, we've listed projects. We've also said for other redevelopment purposes. Now, those proceeds would need to be used within the central redevelopment project area, but if there were the opportunity to build soccer fields, you could use those. These are taxable bonds, and so you have pretty free rein to use them for those types of projects.
Further question?
On the timing of the bond sale, when the bonds were sold, they were lawfully sold under the terms of the state law at that time.
That is correct, and that's really why we pointed that out.
So what happens now if we can't utilize those bond, we're kind of in a catch-22, where the current state law says you can't use those bond proceeds, yet we have bond covenants with bond holders that the city or the former redevelopment agency, somebody, may be in violation of. I mean, somebody may end up getting sued for an impairment of contract, I would think.
That could. Certainly the bonds would not be used for the purpose they were issued. That is for those public improvements, public facilities, and other economic development purposes.
So you, in effect, take your chances at this time with that?
Excuse me?
You take your chances with that. You're making an assumption that you have a path to follow, and we will follow that path. And the result, as to the question that Mr. Ochoa offered there, as to the bonds and their uses, with their original intent, if we depart from that original intent, then what kind of a risk do we take?
I mean, it's unknown. There's some there's some litigation now. Perhaps council knows a little better. There's some litigation now on some existing bonds in that they are not being used for the purpose in which they were issued, which goes to some of the security that the bond insurers had on those. So it's possible that bondholders could say, wait a minute, I'm going to sue somebody because you're not using those bonds for their intended purpose.
Can the state force us to defease those bonds?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Board. That's kind of exactly what the ABX 126 and 1484 did, and this is pretty much some cleanup legislation that that's what I think it is, pretty much cleanup legislation recognizing that there's a 6-month gap, and currently, as the current law sits, there still is that gap. I don't know if that made it a little clearer, but
I think the state has asked for those bonds to be defeased. You could not defease all $650 million of it. There are several of the bond issues out there that have call provisions that may be 10 years out. So you couldn't defease those unless you bought them in the open market.
So if you're a bond holder and the state's requiring you or requiring the agency to defease those bonds, I mean, you made an investment predicated on a rate of return that you otherwise may not be able to find out in the open market today.
Yeah, again, I think it goes more to the security of the bond, because when you issue them, you say, I would like to borrow this money based on this revenue stream, and I'm going to use the bonds to hopefully improve that revenue stream. And so I'm buying the bonds based on that. Very simply, that's what the argument would be. They could say, with the call provision, okay, it's there, I can call those bonds back from you, and you don't have anything to say about it. But that, in some cases, again, we're talking about $650 million of bonds of all differing maturities and types, taxable and tax exempt. You couldn't call those for, in some cases, up to 10 years.
So that money would just sit in somebody's treasury on the sidelines instead of being out in the community putting people back to work.
Paying the debt service on it.
So does that answer your question?
It does in a very disappointing way. But it makes no sense.
Yeah.
You got money. It was lawful. It's a bond issue lawfully sold.
Now you're at risk.
Issuance, and it's just sitting there when it could be used for any number of services, especially without redevelopment. There is no funding currently for economic development in the state, let alone the city of Glendale. This money could be used for that.
Mr. Chair? First of all, I wanted to say that I don't think we should use the resolutions very lightly and keep sending them out every week on every issue that comes in front of us. First, I think that's important. However, that said, I think this is one that definitely requires a resolution if there was ever one. And this is what I'm talking about, saying being a little bit more proactive than just sitting on the sidelines and doing nothing. So with all that said, unless if there's any other questions, I 100% support this resolution, and ask someone to second it.
Second.
Any further discussion? If not, then roll call, please.
And I'm sorry, who seconded it? Okay. Board members Abkarian,
Yes.
Barry,
Yes.
Nakasone, Ochoa,
Yes.
Sheehan,
Yes.
Steger, and Chair Raggio.
Yes. The next item, please.
At 4B is Director of Community Development regarding Alex Theater Expansion Project. At 4B1 is resolution confirming the loan agreement between the City of Glendale and the Glendale Successor Agency in the amount of $750,000 to complete the Alex Theater Expansion Project as an enforceable obligation pursuant to HSC 34173H, and directing staff to include said loan agreement on ROPS 13-14B for the period of January to June 2014.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, we all find ourselves in a difficult spot, and I think the victim of an unintended consequence of the Dissolution Act. We have a project that has a funding gap. One of the solutions that's provided for in the law is for the city of the sponsoring entity, that would be the City of Glendale, to loan money until the next ROPS can be paid. So I'd like to take you through a real quick presentation. This is on the Alex Theater, and explain the problem and the solution, and then ask for your support on that solution. The Alex Theater, to give a bit of context, was built in 1925, and then in the early 90s, the City of Glendale, through their redevelopment agency, purchased the theater and rehabilitated it into a 1,400-seat regional performing arts center. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in the mid-90s. It serves a wide range in all aspects. It's a large area of people that are served by that, really countywide. There are several different events that take place there, from music and comedy to drama and business meetings. There are also educational outreach programs that have touched many of you in the bodies that you represent, as well as support activities, even with Glendale Community College. Glendale Arts, that operates the Alex Theater, through their operations, they have the box office for everything that takes place up at the college. The redevelopment agency, prior to dissolution, entered into 2 agreements with the Alex Theater. One for Glendale Arts to manage the theater for us through a lease, and there is a management agreement that spells out different obligations. These agreements have been recognized by the Successor Agency, this board, as well as the Department of Finance, as enforceable obligations. In fact, you adopted a resolution directing us to continue to implement those agreements. As part of those agreements, there are several capital improvement program projects that keep the theater well maintained. One of those is an expansion project that has been in dire need for several years. The project adds additional space, both dressing room and storage space, which are currently done outside either in large storage containers, above grade, in tents. So winter programs, if a large winter program, you may have actors or other performers running out into a tent in the rain, changing clothes. This will actually create storage space and dressing rooms. It will give them a more efficient and modern way to load and unload shows into the theater through freight elevator and loading dock improvements. All of this will allow for larger productions that will help fill their 1,400 seats. It will also improve the theater's marketability, again, going to the bottom line. Those agreements that I referred to earlier expire in 2015. So the theater in Glendale Arts will be on its own at that time, and this is one of the key projects to self-sufficiency. You've seen the project before, if you recall. What it does is, and Jennifer, if I hit you in your eye and you go blind, I apologize. Really, it's this loading dock, freight elevator, and then underneath here is that 6,600 square feet of dressing room and storage space. We've also given you here an example of the project to the south, Lemley Theater, another project you have considered in the past. This expansion in this project would accommodate that development, and they would use a shared space for both vehicular access and emergency exiting. So why are we bringing this to you now? As I said, the theater needs some self-sufficiency by 2015, and this is the main piece to being able to market the theater and become more financially independent of the city or any city help. The theater needs as much time with this enhanced theater as they can get. I should say Glendale Arts needs as much time with this new theater as they can get before that agreement, which provides a management fee, runs out in 2015. Every time the theater closes, they run the risk of losing whatever tenant might be there. So we had to close the theater last summer for a project. It didn't materialize. They had to struggle to get back to where they were. We will have to close the theater again for 4 months to do this project. They cannot survive with those multiple closures. The other reason the funding is available, the majority of the funding, I should say, is available now on a ROPS funding that was approved by the Department of Finance. Again, to reiterate, the theater must close its doors for construction. They must do it for 4 months. Once the calendar is cleared for those 4 months, they can't say, oh, wait, we're going to stay open, come back, because those tenants and those shows have already found other locations and made contractual commitments. So they need a long lead time for that commitment. Once they make it, they can't go back. And we had to look at it, the funding when it was available, and say we're going to close the theater and move forward with this project. Some schedule constraints pop up. The way the ROPS process is set up is 6 to 7 months before you are going to spend money, you have to give an estimate. Once you give that estimate, there's no opportunity to revise it. You can't go back to the Department of Finance and say, you know what, we realized the number is different than it was before, give us more money. This really does prevent us from using refined numbers. Once we have all of our construction documents done, this prevents us from getting a really good number. So we're working with an estimate. There is no room for margin on this estimate. And what we found is that we have a gap of about $750,000. That is because when 6 to 7 months ago, we were working with a very rough estimate and incomplete plans. In fact, we had to scale the project back to meet the ROPS approved funding. So 6 or 7 months ago, we gave the Department of Finance an estimate. We have actually finished our construction drawings. Those were finished about 2 weeks ago. We did a cost analysis of it, buildability and biddability, and this is where we actually costed out what will be built, and we've discovered this gap. This is a diagram we tried to put together to really show and highlight where this mismatch takes place. Right here in July of 12 is when we were submitting the current ROPS 3, to the Department of Finance, which meant we needed to have an estimate for this project 9 months ago. ROPS 4 is being submitted right here in January. We didn't know until March what our cost was going to be on this project. So we missed 2 ROPS periods before we could know, because we're drawing plans in here. Now, the next ROPS doesn't come until July of 13, when we hope to be under construction, because this is our window, from July to November. Well, if we submit this in with 5, we won't know until November if it's approved. We won't get the money until January of 14. So you see where this is right in the middle of those 2 ROPS periods, and we don't have any way to change it. So what's the solution? Because you can't get money from the state Department of Finance approved, and not that they wouldn't want to, but the process is set up so that you can't. There is a provision in the law 34173H that allows the entity, the sponsoring city, to loan funds to execute enforceable obligations. So in this case, we've asked the city of Glendale to loan the successor agency the funding amount, that gap. We will then ask to put that loan on the ROPS, and we'll know the Department of Finance's response sometime in November, December. We did contact the Department of Finance to make sure that we were doing this correctly. Their indication to us was, indeed, that is what that section is for these very circumstances. We also reached out to our legislators to say, this is an important asset to the region. We think that we would like your assistance if and when the time comes that we need to support our position. The reason that we're bringing it to you today, rather than when we prepare the ROPS, is before the city loans the money, they would like to know that the successor agency is in agreement with this solution, and that in fact you will direct staff to put that on the next ROPS with the intention of approving that on that ROPS. So that's what we're asking for today. These are the terms of the loan as the successor agency, or I should say as the city council has requested, that they will loan the $750,000 from their reserve to the successor agency, that we would place it on the next ROPS, that repayment would be made with the next distribution, so that is January 2014, that interest would accrue at the local area investment fund rate, which is what is prescribed in different places in the Dissolution Act, is if you charge an interest rate, that's what you should use. And then the city also asked to have an interest, some sort of appropriate vehicle to have security in that loan. Once it's paid off, that security goes away. With that, staff is recommending that you approve the loan, that you direct us to put it on the next ROPS with the intention of approving that and sending it off to the Department of Finance.
Questions?
I got a note today, I think, on city taking an interest in a theater property to secure the loan. And the note stated that that interest in the property being transferred from the redevelopment or the successor agency to the city as a security for a loan might be in, and I'm kind of looking at our attorney, I apologize, Mr. Mansfield, because it's a kind of a legal issue, not anything having to do with the merits of what we have here. I actually agree with what we have here. I just want to make sure that legally we don't have any issues of having an interest from a property that is technically owned by the successor agency being transferred to the city for an interest in exchange for a loan being paid to us or to successor agency, so to speak.
Thank you, Board. Yes, we did receive, Mr. Lansafame was kind enough to send me the document as well. And I wouldn't say that the Oversight Board, that we don't have necessarily any problems with it. The issue is that the law is very unclear. it does allow for the loan to be made. It allows for that. And in a separate section, totally separate section, it says that, successor agencies cannot have their assets encumbered. The problem is that it doesn't appear that there's really cohesion between those two sections. So to answer your question, it is up in the air, totally up in the air. When I was talking with Mr. Green today, because we had a chance to talk about this, we were really, because I don't think anybody knows, and I can't give this board a definitive answer, we were really looking at some of the policy behind the two sections. And the policy, from as far as we can tell, pretty much of not encumbering successor agency properties, pretty much to avoid, kind of sham deals, pretty much taking all the equity out of the property, making so that the asset is pretty much worthless. That's not what this board is being asked to do at all. As a matter of fact, there's further policy, and the board is directed that the board are fiduciaries to ensure, fiduciaries to the member entities, to the taxing entities rather. And we were talking about if there is no loan, then what actually happens is that property could in fact be devalued, creating even worse of a problem for for the taxing entities. So in our opinion, although I cannot say for sure one way or the other, and I definitely don't want to give the board that recommendation, because I can't say definitively, should the board wish to allow this kind of encumbrance, in our opinion, there's definitely some reasonable arguments and policy behind the fact that we could definitely make those reasonable arguments. It's not 100% certain, though.
If you don't mind, let me follow this up. So legally, there is nothing in the code that says that we cannot do this.
Not that we found.
Okay. And second, once we approve this loan has to be then reviewed by DOF. And the parameters of the loan has to be approved by the DOF. So it's possible DOF could say we don't accept this interest. But if DOS accepts it, then it basically becomes the state has already accepted it and there are no legal obligations or legal problems. In fact, there won't be any legal issues, because if DOF accepts it and approves it, then they can't turn around and come back and say, hey, why did you approve something we've approved?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure that that's clear, and I'm clear on that.
That was my question. No, Albert said it.
And in fact, if I can add, they get 2 chances to review this, once with the action that's taken today that's sent to them, plus again on the ROPS.
Just wanted to address that issue.
Except for the laws. You've all talked about the laws. The end result is an improvement to the community. And so as a consequence, it has more value than it had before we began this action, if this is taken, which means it's more attractive from a use standpoint than before. So, any further discussion? Roll call, please. Have we had a motion?
No, motion to accept.
Okay.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Board members Abkarian,
Yes.
Barry,
Yes.
Nakasone, Ochoa,
Yes.
Sheehan,
Yes.
Steger, Chair Raggio.
Yes. I think this is a good thing. Next item.
Oral communications, and no cards were submitted.
Is there anyone in the audience who would like to address the Oversight Committee at this time? Seeing none, oral communications are closed. Next item.
Board member and staff comments.
Anyone?
I just have one issue. I no longer, if you don't mind, I think if all the board agrees, everything is online, and we shouldn't have somebody deliver the actual packages to us from now on, because we can actually just click a button and print it if we want to. If that's my suggestion, as far as I'm concerned, I don't need a package to be delivered to me. If I want one, I'll just print one.
I think
This way.
everybody can make a choice.
Yeah. So that would be my choice.
You're right here, you can. And you're right here, so, okay. 2 for electronic and 2 for yelling.
Mr. Chair, would you like yours electronically?
Delivered. I
You'll need it
still
to-
like to go through paper.
Okay.
That's,
We will ask the other,
Generation.
we'll ask the other 2 members their
I
preference.
still read newspapers by opening them up and looking at them. No other staff comments? Do we have need for a closed session? All right. Next item.
Adjournment?
Do I hear a motion for adjournment?
Adjourn?
We are adjourned, and thank you for coming.